Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into a question that I bet has crossed your mind at least once if you've ever, dabbled in virtual reality. Could you actually survive a full 24 hours completely immersed in a VR horror game? It's a pretty wild concept,
It
right?
absolutely grabs you, yeah. The
Yeah.
idea of voluntarily subjecting yourself to that level of sustained virtual terror. It just raises so many questions about what we look for in entertainment and honestly what our minds could even handle.
Exactly. And to help us unpack this fascinating and, yeah, potentially terrifying scenario, we're turning to a discussion from the Mind Melt podcast. We've got some key excerpts from their episode, The VR Horror Experiment, Can You Survive 24 Hours? Their hosts, Alex and Jamie, they really dig into the details of this hypothetical challenge, and we're going to do the same.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to explore that very question, could you actually make it through? We'll be drawing on the insights from Alex and Jamie's chat to understand the potential psychological and physiological consequences of such an intense experience.
Yeah, right from the start, the Mind Melt podcast just throws you into the deep end with this whole 24-hour VR horror thing and immediately makes you wonder, what kind of person would even attempt this? And, well, what on earth would it do to them?
Definitely.
Okay, so let's really get into the nitty-gritty. According to Alex and Jamie, what exactly would this 24-hour VR horror immersion even look like? What are we talking about here?
Well, they paint a pretty vivid and frankly unsettling picture. Imagine being completely strapped into like a top-of-the-line VR system, headset on, plunged into this hyper-realistic horror world. And it's not just, the occasional jump scare.
Right.
It's a whole designed environment meant to overload all your senses. They
Yeah.
talked about constant creepy sounds all around you, even a really unsettling feeling of like phantom touches, like a cold hand brushing your arm when nothing's there.
Ooh, creepy.
Maybe the most disturbing part, they even mentioned simulated smells.
Hmm.
The example was the stench of like rotting wood filling your virtual nostrils.
Ugh. Okay, that's just visceral. And the goal, the seemingly simple but incredibly daunting task, is just to endure all of that for a full 24 hours without taking the headset off, not even for a second.
It really shifts the whole idea of entertainment into something more like, well, an endurance test, wouldn't you say?
Totally.
Which naturally leads to the question I'm sure everyone's thinking, why? Why would anyone put themselves through that? What's the appeal of subjecting your mind to that kind of prolonged virtual terror?
That's precisely the question Alex and Jamie tackled. They highlighted a few potential motivations. One was the straightforward thrill-seeking thing. The adrenaline junkies always looking for the next big rush.
All right, that makes sense.
They also brought up the role of content creators and streamers, people who might see it as a way to grab attention, get views, in a really crowded online space.
That definitely resonates with, well, everything online now. Pushing boundaries, even virtual ones, can generate buzz, can capture an audience. But the Mind Meld podcast, they also touched on something deeper, something about how VR horror uniquely affects you compared to just, say, watching a scary movie.
Right. They really emphasized how immersive VR is. It's not like you're passively watching a screen. With VR, the tech is designed to make you feel like you're actually there, inside the nightmare.
The feeling of presence, yeah.
Yeah, they even brought up Resident Evil 7, remember that, and how people had these incredibly strong reactions to it, physically recoiling, knocking stuff over.
Oh, yeah, I remember seeing videos of that.
And that was just from relatively short bursts of gameplay. Imagine that level of immersion, but for 24 solid hours.
It really underscores the power of that presence VR creates. It blurs the lines between what's virtual and what your brain thinks is real in a way that, well, traditional media just can't match.
Mm-hmm.
And this leads to a really crucial point, how our brains actually respond to this virtual fear.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because even though logically it's not real, right? It's a game. The Mind Melt podcast highlighted that VR can still trigger those really deep primal fear responses. They even referenced studies suggesting VR activates the brain's fear centers in a way that's remarkably similar to how they react to genuine danger.
Exactly. It's that lizard brain reaction they discussed.
Hmm.
Our more primitive brain structures, the ones handling fight or flight, they perceive the threat in VR as real, even if your higher level logical brain is saying, dude, it's just pixels.
Right, it's a simulation.
That disconnect, that battle between logic and instinct, is key to understanding the potential impact of prolonged exposure.
And to dig deeper into this, the Mind Melt podcast actually spoke with a neuroscientist, Dr. Evelyn Marsh. She offered some really insightful perspectives on the science of what happens to your brain under that kind of sustained virtual horror. What were some of her main points?
Well, Dr. Marsh suggested that prolonged VR horror could lead to several pretty significant psychological effects. She mentioned adrenaline fatigue, which, I mean, that makes sense, right? Your body can only stay on high alert for so long before it just wears out.
You'd crash hard.
But she also raised concerns about developing paranoia and even temporary dissociation, that's a pretty significant potential impact. Dissociation is like a temporary feeling of detachment from your surroundings or even from yourself, almost like your mind trying to distance itself from the overwhelming experience.
Wow. Temporary dissociation. That sounds pretty serious.
Yeah.
So it's not just about being scared in the moment. It's about the potential for your brain to get genuinely overwhelmed, maybe even temporarily altered by this constant flood of virtual fear.
Precisely. And they also touched on the very real physical responses. Your heart rate would likely be through the roof. You'd probably be sweating. Your body reacts as if it's facing a real threat.
Fight or flight, yeah.
That constant state of physiological arousal, it just can't be healthy long term, even if the threat isn't physically there. It really shows how hard it is for your body to tell the difference between virtual and real in these super immersive VR experiences.
Okay, so the podcast paints a pretty intense picture of what this 24-hour ordeal could do. But then they shifted gears a bit, started discussing some hypothetical survival strategies. Now, these were maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, but were there any interesting nuggets in there?
That part definitely added some humor, but yeah, there were some points to consider, even if the whole scenario is pretty out there. They jokingly suggested things like trying to take breaks, even within the game, maybe finding a, quote, safe space in the virtual world to just collect yourself for a second.
Like a save room in Resident Evil?
Kind of, yeah. Staying hydrated was another practical tip.
Yeah.
And the surprisingly insightful suggestion of not wearing socks to avoid slipping on a hard floor during jump scares.
The no socks rule. I hadn't thought of that, but it totally makes sense. Nothing worse than wiping out when you're already terrified by some virtual monster.
Exactly. And then there were some more mental or emotional strategies they talked about.
Like what?
What? The idea of practicing Zen breathing techniques to try and manage the fear response, which, might actually help a bit.
Maybe.
And then there was the amusing contrast of comfort objects. The suggestion of having a stuffed animal for emotional support versus the, let's say, more proactive approach of having a baseball bat nearby.
A baseball bat for a virtual threat.
Well, yeah, to deal with any perceived threats, I guess.
Yeah.
The image of someone in a full VR rig clawing a teddy bear while also brandishing a bat is quite something.
It really highlights the potential for a very intense, maybe contradictory emotional state you might find yourself in, and the very personal ways people might try to cope. Speaking of personal experiences, the Mind Melt podcast also shared some anecdotal stuff from their listeners who, dipped their toes into VR horror. What did those accounts suggest?
All right, they brought in some real-world accounts, well, within their podcast world anyway, that offer a glimpse into how varied reactions can be. One listener, Sarah, I think, she reported trying a 12-hour session in some haunted asylum VR game.
12 hours.
It only lasted 8 before being totally overwhelmed. Apparently ended up just ordering pizza. The anecdote about the delivery driver maybe thinking she was a ghost because she was so disoriented afterwards.
Oh my God.
It adds humor, but it really shows the intensity of her reaction.
8 hours is still a long time in virtual terror. And then there was another listener, Mike. His experience was shorter, but still pretty impactful.
Yeah, Mike's experience with just a 1-hour demo was telling, especially for his cat, apparently. The story goes, his terrified scream made the cat. Well, the joke was the cat filed a restraining order.
Poor cat.
Obviously an exaggeration, but it emphasizes the visceral reaction even short VR horror bursts can cause. These anecdotes, even the funny ones, they give us a sense of the diverse, often intense ways people react,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So bringing it all together, based on the Mind Melt podcast's exploration, we've really taken a dive into this whole 24-hour VR horror idea. We've looked at how incredibly immersive VR is, how it taps into our basic fear responses, the potential psychological and physical toll prolonged exposure could take, and even some entertaining, maybe surprisingly relevant survival ideas.
We have indeed. And considering the intensity and potential psychological impact discussed in the source material, it really leaves you, the listener, with a fascinating question, doesn't it? What does our willingness, our maybe even desire, to engage with simulated fear Tell us about human nature.
Yeah, why do we do it?
What drives this need to push boundaries, even in the digital realm, and maybe most importantly, considering everything we've talked about? Is there a point where the virtual becomes too real for our minds? What are the long-term implications?
Mm.
It's definitely something to mull over.
For sure, a lot to think about there.